Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Tina Campt, and I'm a professor at Brown's Department of Modern Culture and Media. I'm also the convener of the Black Visualities Initiative at the Cogut Center for the Humanities, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the first Black Visualities event of the 2020 school year. This event is particularly significant because it's an intra- and inter-institutional collaboration. On the one hand, I am grateful to the partnership with the Brown Arts Initiative, and I need to thank Kira and Talia and Greg and Sean for their help putting this event together. I also need to thank very, very strenuously Damien Mahit and Kit Salisbury for their help on the Cogut end. On the other hand, I am equally grateful to my two partners, Stanley Wolukau-Wanambwa at RISD and Tavia Nyong'o at the Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration, that is a mouthful, at Yale University, for making this a joint event of organizing both this public conversation as well as studio and seminar visits with Cameron and Thomas at their own institutions. These collaborations are really at the center of what the Black Visualities Initiative is all about, which is first and foremost about bringing artists, students, scholars, and activists into conversation to think about the role of visual culture, both in relationship to the long history of Black dispossession, as well as its potentially transformative role in creating new possibilities for living and imagining Black life otherwise. The practice of collaboration is also critical to the work of our two speakers this evening, and we are delighted to be able to host them tonight. Continuing in the spirit of collaboration, following these welcoming remarks, Tavia Nyong'o will be presenting Cameron and Thomas to you, who will be in conversation for about 40 to 45 minutes. Their conversation will be followed by a discussion with Stanley Wolukau-Wanambwa. A few details about the format: the conversation will be closed captioned for accessibility. And if you would like to pose any questions for discussion, please pose them using the Q&A function. The chat function is disabled. The Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. So again, welcome. We are looking forward to a wonderful conversation. And without further delay, I'm going to hand off to Tavia to get us started. Tavia?
Thank you, Professor Campt. I'm really delighted to be introducing tonight's two speakers and looking forward to the conversation. I'll jump right into it. How can we enter a gallery, view 11 bicycles, including children's bicycles, seized by the police and sold at auction for $237, and not bear witness to an ongoing war against impoverished and racialized communities in which the museum and the university is complicit? Cameron Rowland is an artist who makes visible these institutions, systems, and policies that perpetuate systemic racism and economic injustice. His research-intensive work centers around the display of objects and documents whose provenance and operations expose the legacies of racial capitalism and underscore the forms of exploitation that permeate everyday life. His work renews traditions of institutional critique and employs system aesthetics to reveal the afterlives of slavery in contracts, leases, mortgages, encumbrances, and asset forfeiture. In tracing this ongoing process of land and capital accumulation through racial dispossession, Rowland's work interrogates the possibility of reparation. He does so with a combination of rigor and sensitivity that manages to scale the world historical down to ephemeral fragments and indelible traces that leave viewers of his exhibitions deeply implicated in the systems he confronts. A graduate of Wesleyan University, Rowland's work has been exhibited in the Sao Paulo Biennial, the Whitney Museum of Art, Vienna Succession, Artist Space, and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, amongst other venues. His work is represented in public collections, including those of the Museum of Modern Art and the Art Institute of Chicago. In 2019, he won the MacArthur Genius Award. How can art curation do justice to its root meaning as an act of care? What might it mean to take care of the collective, ephemeral, and improvisatory practices through which Black, queer, and minoritarian people imagine life otherwise. Thomas Lax has devoted his career to pursuing these questions for 7 years at the Studio Museum in Harlem, and more recently at the Museum of Modern Art, where he was named curator of media and performance in 2019. Some highlights of his curatorial career include Queer Peer Art and Archives on the occasion of the 10-year anniversary of Fierce, a queer youth of color collective, When the Stars Begin to Fall, Imagination and the American South at the Studio Museum, a show which queried the category of outsider art, the 2015 edition of PS1's Quincentennial, Greater New York, and Judson Dance Theater, The Work Is Never Done at MoMA, where he is also preparing the exhibition Just Above Midtown, 1974 to the Present, which considers the key role of independent Black gallery spaces. Lax is also a teacher, a mentor, and a gifted writer. His work on all these fronts reveals a steadfast determination to name the tensions and contradictions in the work he does with and for communities who have been and remain excluded from the institutions and systems of value that define modern and contemporary art. A graduate of Brown University and Columbia University, Lax was awarded the Walter Hopps Award for Curatorial Achievement and was in 2019 a Center for Curatorial Leadership Fellow. Please join me in welcoming to the screen Thomas Lax and Cameron Rowland.
Oh yeah, thank you so much for that warm introduction to Cameron and me. It's wonderful to see you even from afar.
Beautiful.
I also wanted to thank Stanley Wolukau-Wanambwa and Tina Campt for offering us this invitation to speak in Providence in the context of the Black Visualities Initiative. It's an honor to be part of the community that you're creating. And even though we're over here and you're over there, we're nevertheless together. I also wanted to thank on Cameron and my behalf, Sean Tavares and Greg Picard. In titling tonight's talk, Continuous Refusal, Collective Refusal, Cameron and I follow and echo the collective of which Tavia and Tina are part, practicing refusal, as well as Tina's theorizations on refusal, which have been so important to Cameron and me, like many of us. I understand this idea of Black refusal to be about an insistence on our future and a study of embodied counterintuitive poses. Stasis, or the holding of opposing forces, is one of these poses, which Tina describes as, quote, neither an absence nor a cessation of motion, but a continual balancing of multiple forces in equilibrium. This equilibrium hums in us tonight.
As Thomas describes, we wanted to orient our conversation around the ways that refusal and the refusal of property and that which property confers is a collective practice across the Black radical tradition. That is to say that different forms of refusal operate in conjunction with each other through time. So rather than thinking about this as an accumulated, individualized inheritance, it could be regarded as a togetherness that contravenes the individualist expectations of freedom. As Stephanie Campt writes of absenteeism as practiced among the enslaved, the distinction between individual and collective resistance then offers only an aphoristic description of truancy in practice, just as the difference between the individual and collective resistance is misleading, so is the separation of political principle and personal sentiment. So following Stephanie Campt's framing of the distinction between individual and collective resistance as, quote, misleading, I think we'd like to discuss some of the ways we're imagining our work as part of being together in refusal.
A short note on format. Continuous refusal, collective refusal is a call and call amongst friends. As Tina mentioned, Cameron and I will speak for about 45 minutes, each offering some context for our respective practices, and then describing one of our collaborations together. We're thrilled to be joined afterwards by Stanley and all of you. I'll begin by describing two projects I co-organized at the Museum of Modern Art. The first is an exhibition on Just Above Midtown, or JAM, a commercial art gallery and a self-described laboratory for African-American artists and artists of color, led by Linda Good Bryant between 1974 and 1986. Linda and I are currently working on this show, asking what, in a weekly, daily basis, how the past continues to live in the present, and how a gallery that was founded in the 1970s as a way to create an alternative to the museum might live at the Museum of Modern Art in 2022. Linda and I have asked this question perpetually, and over the last 3 years, we have asked it directly to the artists who showed at JAM. When the director of the Studio Museum, Thelma Golden, asked David Hammonds, an artist who had famously showed at the gallery, about doing a retrospective exhibition about JAM, Hammonds replied, "You should just turn off all the lights." Implied in his statement was that the gallery had thrived not by selling the art necessary to pay its electric bills, but rather by evacuating the value of art and imbuing its context, even when empty of all art to sell, with the capacity to give us the things that we need. This is one of the ways I understand the continuous collective work Cameron and I hope to be up to tonight. How might the stakes of different time periods touch one another? How can we both care for and contest the culture produced and the circles that receive it? I don't think that when this exhibition opens, in all likelihood, you'll walk into a darkened gallery, although who knows, but the germ of this idea will be in there. Continuity is also filled with breaks, ruptures, and refusals. To reanimate or extend the life of a past work into the present is not an attempt to mimic artistic intention or to reproduce original context, but rather to renegotiate the work's constituent terms, especially when those terms exist in a darkened space, seemingly outside of the work of art. For the remainder of my time, I'll speak on another exhibition, a recent interpretation of a historical space, 2018 show I co-organized with Anna Yanevsky and Martha Joseph, among many others in our curatorial department, whose names Cameron is generously adding to the chat. The exhibition, Judson Dance Theater, The Work Is Never Done, took Judson Dance Theater, a group of interdisciplinary artists who briefly came together just for 2-3 years in the early 1960s, working in a church in Greenwich Village. Our show was motivated by an argument about group work, defined in 2 ways. Group work described the way Judson was a site of assembly, a workshop where artwork was collectively produced and received. Group work also described the process through which that history matters in the present, the way it was narrated by a curatorial and artistic team who came together to debate the stakes of this work in the present and perhaps for the future. Rather than attempting to offer a panoramic view of this project, I will home in on one paradigmatic example of how this idea of group work played out in a set of relationships. The example offers an occasion to think through how an artwork made in the past continues to live in the present, and how relationships between artists and potentially to people who work in institutions like museums animate the ongoing lives of artworks. Consider Simone Forti's Seesaw from 1960. In the early 60s, Forti premiered Seesaw in downtown Manhattan as part of a series of works she called dance constructions. As indicated by their title, each blurred the distinction between dance and construction, sculpture, and performance. The constructions were made of inexpensive materials, like the ones you see here, plywood and rope, and the dances were generated by manipulating and moving these objects, or by following a set of rules that frequently pushed the performers to their physical limits. While their actions were ordinary, they leaned, they whistled, they stood, their social significance was revealed via the performers' interactions. Seesaw used a recognizable form, the teeter-totter associated with childhood playgrounds. As documented in this photograph, the work was performed in 1961 at Yoko Ono's loft on Chambers Street by artists Yvonne Rainer and Robert Morris, to whom Forti was married at the time. Rainer and Morris would later get together. In this iteration of the work, Rainer and Morris assembled the seesaw in real time, placing the plank on the sawhorse. They balanced on the plywood, shifting their weight up and down. At one point, Rainer shrieked while Morris read from the art newspaper, Art News. Reflecting on the work, Forti said that the performers enacted a domestic drama. As the performers stood on the plywood and tried to maintain equilibrium, they inevitably shift up and down, a physical manifestation of the oscillations that occur between two friends, artistic collaborators, or lovers. MoMA acquired Seesaw for its collection in 2016. The work does not exist in the physical form you see here, but rather as a set of relationships. So just to be very clear, this does not sit in MoMA's collection storage, and the entirety of its materiality exists in the relationships I'll describe. Working with Forti for over 2 years, my colleague Stuart Comer and Anna Yanevsky developed instructions for the work's future constructions and performances, partnering with Simone, as well as the organization Dance Space Project, to create a set of workshops for performers to learn the work. As Yanevsky has said, the transmission of the work happens through study, through collective gestures from one body to another. Forti's prompts for Seesaw are at once precise and capacious. She stipulates pretty much as the one requirement that the two performers who sit across from one another have an existing relationship. In 2018, when Anna, Martha, and I came together to co-organize the exhibition on Judson Dance Theater, we included this work as a key forerunner to Judson. We invited dancer, choreographer, artists Will Rawls and Andrew Zinsbrown to offer their interpretation of the work. Rawls describes his practice as exploring the, quote, instability of identity and form afforded by live performance. For his part, Zinsbrown identifies his interest in how, quote, the human body, movement, and matter can interact until a certain melting point is reached, and the diverse media appear to take on each other's properties. Both knew Forti's work and met with her to make their interpretation. During the rehearsals, Will and Andros invited a third performer, Martita Bradale, a performer, artist, teacher, who is also on the staff of the organization MR, or Movement Research, to perform in the work with them. In this way, their trio echoed the shape of the work's earlier triangulation. If you'll allow us, we'll play a few minutes of the video recording of the work. To give you some sense of context of where we are, midway through the performance, Will says, "Hi, Simone." Andros responds, "Good to see you again. We just have a few questions for you."
word you keep using. Equilibrium.
También tenemos curiosidad de esta palabra que usaste.
Yeah, this is funny word.
Equilibrio. Es una palabra chistosa.
And this idea that I'm here and you're over there.
Not just an idea.
Y esta idea de que yo estoy aquí y tú estás allá.
We're in this together.
Estamos en esto juntos.
Being on the bottom doesn't mean you're weaker.
Pero no significa que estar abajo es menos.
It's a beautiful idea.
Es una idea muy hermosa.
Refusal and intimacy, conflict and vulnerability, domestic and domestica. Asa, he says, domestic life, was wondering about it. Will and Andros and Martita, two planks, two sides of the plank and the fulcrum too. This idea that I'm over here and you're over there, not just an idea.
Thank you so much for sharing that, T. I remain so inspired by the ways that you allow for these connections amongst us, and over time, it relates to a lot of how I've been thinking about being together as well. Over the past 6 years or so, I've been thinking about the capacity of an artwork to materialize the relations of reparations. Part of my effort has been to foreground the multiplicity that reparations holds, and to think about that multiplicity as it extends beyond the scope of practicality. The tradition of pursuing reparations as a Black feminist practice across generations includes seminal figures such as Callie House, Queen Mother Audley Moore, Jonita Scott, and Deidre Farmer-Pahlman, all of whom have in their respective times created collective ground for insisting on and reimagining what reparations might be. In my mind, this tradition marks a refusal to accept the validity of property derived through slavery and its afterlives. Reparations then necessarily contests the retention of this property and poses a challenge to the definition, formation, and existence of property. The variety of conceptions of what reparations might be is part of its capacity. This plurality of reparations acknowledges the impossibility of undoing past violence while necessitating the ongoing and endless work of repair. As a tradition, it continues to be animated and reanimated. Deidre Farmer-Pahlman's lawsuit, the first to pursue reparations from corporate entities enriched from the economy of enslavement, was fought as recently as 2002 to 2007. This slide is from the C-SPAN coverage of the Millions for Reparations March in August of 2002, which helped build attention for Farmer-Pahlman's case. Although the court declined to acknowledge the terms of her claim and to rule in her favor, the case has dramatically impacted my and many others' conception of what reparations might be. This was the basis for the work titled Disgorgement, made in 2016, which we'll discuss in greater depth a bit later. Disgorgement consists of a purpose trust that holds shares in what was formerly Aetna, now CVS, until federal reparations are paid, at which point the contents of the trust are transferred to the federal body in charge of distributions as a corporate addendum. Farmer Paleman's capacity to conceive of reparations not as a tort payment for damages, but as repayment of unjustly enriched profits residing within corporate entities, outlines the ways that reparations discourse exceeds the scope of dominant legal, economic, and political practice. It has caused me to ask, if the regime of property was integral to the violence of slavery and colonization, then how might we imagine reparations as something other than the redistribution of property? This has been a guiding question in my attempts to conceive of reparations as the reduction, relinquishment, and antagonism of property and its value. Many cite General Sherman's Field Order 15 as the origin of reparations claims. Like others, I had understood that 40 acres and a mule had been promised to ex-slaves following the end of the Civil War, but was never granted. In fact, during 1865, approximately 40,000 ex-slaves were resettled on the basis of possessory title, with up to 40 acres per family, only to have these lands taken away by the Andrew Johnson administration in 1866. Following Johnson's orders to return these lands to the former Confederate owners, numerous former slaves refused to leave and refused to work for the master as slaves, sharecroppers, convict leased laborers, or any other arrangement. In refusing to leave the property and planting it for subsistence rather than trade, the formerly enslaved collectively reduced the value of these properties. The refusal of land as property constitutes a form of reparations that I tried to articulate in the work Depreciation, made in 2018. Depreciation consists of a restrictive covenant recorded on 1 acre of land on Edisto Island. This covenant renders the market value of the land to be $0. The previous images are of the property at 8060 Maxey Road, where the acre is located, taken as part of the appraisal that confirmed the estimated value to be $0. In thinking of the pursuit of reparations as a refusal of property, other violations of property may in turn be conceived of as reparative. Acts that violated the terms of enslavement, such as stealing away, working slowly, being truant, in addition to theft and arson, challenged the regime of ownership. These violations might simultaneously be regarded as resistant and reparative. The collective work of resistance enacted continuously across the Caribbean over the course of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries contributed to the declining productivity of the British colonies and the political economic interest in abandoning the West Indian plantation system. This is an excerpt of the first page of the damage report submitted to Parliament by Jamaican plantation owners following the property destruction inflicted by the 1832 Baptist Rebellion. These incursions on the value of property enacted and constituted by the enslaved, in my mind, are a form of repair that we might continue to think about as much of this property continues to be inherited, exchanged, and to generate profits. This framework of reparations is the basis for the 5 works titled Encumbrance, made in 2020, each of which consists of one of the 5 mahogany elements in the building at 12 Carlton House Terrace in London, and a mortgage. 12 Carlton House Terrace is owned by the Crown Estate and is leased to the Institute of Contemporary Arts. These elements have been mortgaged by the ICA to Encumbrance Inc., a company I created for the express purpose of holding these mortgages indefinitely. The debts will not be paid back, and Encumbrance Inc. will hold a security interest in these mahogany elements. This security interest will constitute an encumbrance on the future transaction of 12 Carlton House Terrace. This encumbrance diminishes the market value of the Crown Estate's property. All of these works hinge on numerous forms of collaboration on the legal, institutional, and intellectual level. Thomas and I work closely together in creating conditions to sustain disgorgement until federal reparations are paid, which is to say, the long term. I think Thomas's conviction around their project is not only unique, but is something that is rare in a field where curatorial work is typically encouraged to stand as an extension of the institution. Because the stakes of what I'm working on are often in contention with the state expectations of the institution. Collaborating with someone whose larger project is aligned with my own is not only meaningful, but allows for things that would not otherwise be possible.
The collaborative process that Cameron is describing began with their show at the downtown alternative arts organization Artist Space, which was titled 910-20000. 910-20000 is a customer identification number that was assigned to Artist Space by Corecraft, a division of New York State's Department of Corrections that conscripts incarcerated people to produce low-cost goods. Corecraft sold several of the works in the exhibition, including the benches you see in the left of this photo. By asking Artist Space to register with Corecraft and then using this number to name the work in the exhibition, Cameron implicated it in other nonprofit organizations who regularly buy goods made by incarcerated people, citing themselves within the long tail of involuntary servitude. If this small arts nonprofit was implicated in a chain of relations already connected to the extensiveness of the carceral state, then surely the Museum of Modern Art was too. After seeing the exhibition with Cameron, I began speaking with my colleague Kathy Halbreich, MoMA's associate director. We talked about how we might leverage the museum to not only support the ambitions of Cameron's project, in other words, the network of relations and the beauty of the entangled space their show had created, but to do so through the terms it proposed, which in this case, for a museum whose cultural value is often measured through acquisition in its collection, meant a reconsideration of the terms of a museum accession. Typically when museums acquire a work of art, they're gifted it by a trustee or a donor, or buy it directly from an artist or their gallery. And while some of Cameron's works were for sale, including the lashing bars used for insurance purposes on top of ships, seen in this exhibition view, many, including those produced by imprisoned people, like the manhole leveler rings you see on the ground here, were not sold, but rather rented for renewable 5-year terms at their cost of original purchase, ensuring that the value deemed by the state is continually attached to the work after it extends into a different context. During a meeting to raise funds for these rentals, Kathy responded to a question inquired about the reason behind their rental status, saying, maybe Cameron doesn't want to be owned. A third means of transfer was designated for disgorgement, seen in the upper left, the purpose trust Cameron mentioned earlier that holds shares until federal reparations are paid. Over the course of a year, my colleagues and I, along with Cameron and team of lawyers, have negotiated an extended loan of the work, along with a freshly drafted side agreement. In approaching Cameron about an acquisition of a work that planned for reparations, we understood that this work in particular was explicitly contesting the terms of ownership. The task of acquisition was conceived as a place to intervene where artistic and curatorial work might happen alongside of one another. The invitation was premised on the idea that MoMA's capacity for preserving this work, represented by the framed contract papers, was different from many other works. While normally the future of an artwork's conservation is considered around the terms of its physical properties, fungible materials like bologna or dung, this artwork required a different method of considering its posterity and futurity that did not take place within the conservation department, but rather within the nonprofit status of the museum.
So, as you can tell, each of my works has this descriptive caption. I think of these captions as part of the material of the work. This is the first half of the caption for disgorgement. The materials of disgorgement are reparations, purpose trust, and Aetna shares. It specifically uses Aetna shares because Aetna's slave insurance policies were the basis for Deirdre Farmer-Pahlman's research when she was tracing the lineage of contemporary insurance companies to slave insurance practices. Aetna is one of the few companies that has stayed intact continuously, and is one of the companies that was connected to her own family. This was, led Aetna to become, one of the first defendants in the claim that Farmer-Pahlman levied, and was also central as in the slavery era insurance disclosure laws that Farmer-Pahlman helped to pass in numerous states beginning in 2000. The Reparations Purpose Trust is a trust instrument that I outlined with curator Richard Burkett and executed with lawyers Ruth Mattson and Alexander Bove. The caption's description of the trust mechanics reads, "The Reparations Purpose Trust forms a conditionality between the time of deferral and continued corporate growth. The general purpose of this trust is to acquire and administer shares in Aetna Inc. and to hold such shares until the effective date of any official action by any branch of the United States government to make financial reparations for slavery, including but not limited to the enactment and subsequent adoption of any recommendations pursuant to H.R. 40, Commission to Study Reparation Proposals for African Americans Act. As a purpose trust registered in the state of Delaware, this trust can last indefinitely and has no named beneficiaries. The initial holdings of Reparations Purpose Trust consists of 90 Aetna shares. In the event that federal financial reparations are paid, the trust will terminate and its shares will be liquidated and granted to the federal agency charged with distributions as a corporate addendum to these payments. The grantor of the Reparations Purpose Trust is Artist Space. Its trustee is Michael M. Gordon, and its enforcer is Cameron Rowland. The Reparations Purpose Trust gains tax exemption from its grantor's nonprofit status. MoMA has agreed to continue the trust if Artist Space is no longer able to serve as the grantor. The work is intended to both set up the stated conditionality and to mark out the scale of accumulation over the time of deferral. That is, the number of years may be a less useful way of measuring the time of deferred reparations than the scale of corporate growth that results from it. A typical trust works like a letter to send assets from one party to another over time. Key instrument of inheritance. The grantor is akin to the sender of the letter. The trust is the envelope. The assets are the contents, and the beneficiary is the recipient. And then the trustee ensures what is being sent arrives at the designated time. So most trusts need a stated beneficiary and point of divestiture, but using Delaware Trust Code for purpose trusts, this trust does not have either. Because the grantor is a nonprofit, it is able to grow tax exempt. And the complexity of implicating an art institution required a certain level of risk and burden on the institution's behalf. And this would not have been possible without Richard Burkitt, Stephen Kalmar, and Artist Space as a whole organization. So when Thomas opened up the conversation with MoMA, our goal was to imagine how MoMA might support the long-term viability of the work. We agreed not to have MoMA supplant Artist Space immediately, but rather agree to take its place in the event that Artist Space is unable to continue serving as the grantor. The stability of MoMA as a major institution was something we envisioned using to allow the trust to continue to exist. This commitment consists of a side agreement pictured here, which is not currently included in what I call the component of the work intended for exhibition, which is in the frames as the work, it's not just pieces of paper, but it's the assets of the company, and it's all of the growth that incurs. The final line of the caption has been added to signal the existence of this side agreement, however.
What Cameron's describing was a process, a negotiation, and ultimately an agreement between the Office of General Counsel and my colleague Patty Lipschutz and the Painting and Sculpture Department led by Ann Temkin. These colleagues and I discussed how taking on a fiduciary responsibility would implicitly mean MoMA would take a political stance on the issue of reparations. Ultimately, this had to be acceptable both from a curatorial and administrative position. Part of this conversation was the recognition that all forms of acquisition carry with them the support of an artwork and its possible futures, as well as the ideological assumptions embedded within the category of property, through which other paintings and sculptures typically enter into the museum's collection. Setting up other terms of acquisition in which the institution is not the owner is not the norm, but in drawing relief and marking itself from the norm, this work draws attention to the assumptions around property that the institution makes regularly, and perhaps the continuity between property as a category and historical forms of dispossession that emanate from slavery and other forms of involuntary servitude.
Yeah, part of my hope for the work is that it can both confront the expectation of an artwork to function as property and simultaneously reflect on the means of accumulation and inheritance that enable wealth to be retained in institutions like MoMA to exist. So in advocating for the museum to come into relation with the work, Thomas was really a collaborator in materializing and mobilizing those tensions without allowing MoMA to take ownership of them. I think this is part of what's facilitated by the alignment in how we're thinking about our projects and our projects' relationship to other people's projects and all the ways that they overlap and inform each other.
One thing that I love about this work of yours, Cam, is how its supposed or potential failure also becomes a value. One example is that if the United States were to institute a single-payer healthcare system, something that when initially the word work was constructed and lent by you was differently possible than it has become. In that event, then Aetna's assets would have become worthless and the trust would have been dissolved and unable to distribute its funds. So in this way, the kind of eventuality of the work is itself deferred or displaced, in my understanding, so that reparations, what it promises or stipulates, like emancipation or abolition, is not considered to be a one-time event, but rather this work, like the other artworks you've talked about, are reiterative and engage, a history of kind of continuity as the mode through which these different forms of freedom might be achieved in an ongoing way. working within an institution and with you to imagine this future is not, I don't think, our attempt at resolution or a kind of arrival at reparations as a kind of teleological endpoint, but rather a project that we are continuously contributing to, drawing on countervailing forces and finding what looks and might feel like stasis, but is everywhere in motion around us. So maybe we'll invite Stanley back into the Zoom room.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you both so much for such a thoughtful and expansive survey of some of the ideas central to your collaboration and to your sort of individual interests as well. I have, unsurprisingly, quite a few questions, and also I've had the benefit of being involved in listening to you talking earlier today in Tavia Nyonga's seminar, and then again last week, actually, Cameron, when you spoke in the IDS lecture series that Cooper Union runs, and I think Omar's with us today. So I have lots of things I'd like to ask, and some of them maybe aren't connected to what had immediately occurred just in this last few minutes. I just want to remind our attendees that you can enter questions into the Q&A function that's available to you in the interface for Zoom, or the toolbar that might be at the bottom of your Zoom application window. And I and other panelists will be reviewing those, and we'll be happy to feed some in. But just if I could try to work maybe sort of backwards chronologically through a couple of points, and we'll see where that lands and which questions come up. I have a couple of questions to ask you right off the bat. And one of them is tied to disgorgement and also the work that we were just now seeing you discussing. And also there's something, Cameron, that you'd said in the seminar this morning with Tavia, which was how difficult it is for people to visualize all the various strategies and successes of refusal against the depredations of anti-Blackness that have happened historically. You know, we can trace the stock price chart, the historical lineage of accumulation under racial capitalism through the forms and events of differing institutions, right? Differing geographies, et cetera, and that's certainly an important aspect of the broader question. But it's very hard to see the countervailing forces that were operative simultaneously with them. And I was thinking about you saying that earlier as you were describing disgorgement, and thinking about MoMA's position in this work, because you described MoMA as the sort of a relation with MoMA as helping to mark out the time of deferral to a governmental decision to agree to reparations, and at the same time marking out the scale of corporate growth that will occur in that ongoing interval, which we may all assume could be very, very open-ended. And so the work, it seems to me, starts to make visible both starts to make visible and to attach the institution of MoMA to the reality of an ongoing refusal on the part of institutional power to acknowledge what it is constituted by, its constitution in and through racial expropriation, while also being an attempt in and of itself to refuse those conditions or to reverse them. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about this question of how you think in your work about making visible both practices of refusal and resistance and evasion, and also at the same time making ubiquitous forces of anti-Black violence more palpable and more visible for people.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of as complicated as you describe, and I think that it's not even that it's easy to sort of envision or comprehend the scale of accumulation predicated on expropriation. But it's easier to envision that or comprehend that as somehow coinciding with, you know, our linear constructions of time, right? And it's, as you just said, right, the growth of a stock is measured, you know, on this linear scale. And so disgorgement is, you know, it's partly saying, well, could we just have this one adjustment and say, you know, as opposed to thinking about reparations as this completely unknowable number, right? And or a completely unknowable, unimaginable type of rearrangement. What is actually happening while we're having this conversation? And, like, you know, since that thing was created in 2016, it's nearly, you know, doubled in value. That's 4 years, right? So so that's, you know, I think for me, even just having that is actually been a helpful exercise in trying to comprehend the scale of accumulation. But as I was saying earlier, I think, yes, what's much more difficult is to try to imagine, you know, what that accumulation might look like without all of the forms of refusal and resistance that have been imposed, and that we would be remiss in calling failed, because they are incursions, and their incursion has, you know, all forms of consequence. So, you know, I think I'm trying to just hold these things together, and they maybe materialize to different extents in different ways. That sort of reduction of value is something I've been thinking about, you know, in particular in encumbrance, but I think it's also, you know, at play to a certain extent in disgorgement, because, you know, as Thomas was sort of saying, given certain events, the dissolution of the trust also sort of dissolves the, you know, the MoMA's claim to this piece of cultural production. Right? There's not really a thing there anymore once it's no longer active. Yeah, so that kind of way, even though it's sort of this measuring tool, and it is attending to these questions of corporate redistribution, I'm also trying to think about, you know, the property relations that are at play within its status as a word.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I wanted, just, if I could, Thomas, to ask you as well about, and a word I want to use here is precedent, with the way that it's inflected, with certain legal connotations. But, you know, you were discussing earlier how the decision on the part of MoMA to get engaged in disgorgement bonded together fiduciary and political commitments, you know, that would be true over time. And I would imagine that central to that discussion was a reckoning with the reality that their engagement with this artwork commits them to a politics that is expressly opposed to anti-Blackness, and that's supportive of a politics of reparation. And I think it establishes a precedent in a way that might be actionable for those of us who consider ourselves to be members of the broader community, to which the museum addresses itself, and that establishes a precedent and a measure, to come back to that term, Cameron, by which we can evaluate decisions that the institution makes, whether in the form of the composition of its board, or in the form of its activities around property and real estate, or in the form of its programs, and so on, or its hiring practices, and so on and so forth. And I'm curious how you think about the precedent of MoMA's relationship with disgorgement in terms of a broader community's relationship to the institution. So in a way, not quite concerning Cameron's work, but concerning MoMA as a party in the cultural landscape more broadly.
Yeah, I'm thinking about your question, Stanley, kind of in two directions. I think one, I heard your question first as like the precedents for Cameron's work, which in a way became a way of thinking about how works that are made before this work might be differently perceived after this work is now in the collection. And what I'm thinking of here is, not only the histories of the kind of ready-made or conceptualism or institutional critique that one might imagine as the kind of, linear precedents to Cameron's work being distinguished from the kinds of objects of critique that are made present in this work. And just to be explicit, I'm thinking here of the way that, in institutional critique of another generation, the museum is often imagined to be the kind of site or target of a certain kind of, the location in which criticism happens. And I think what's so important about this is that, this project, the museum is just party to a network of relations. And I think perhaps after this work is in MoMA's collection, there's a kind of expansiveness to think about the museum's relationship to other institutions of disciplinary control. And so that feels like, there's a kind of generosity to that. Another kind of precedent is to think about the history of objects made by other people living and working in conditions of involuntary servitude as being under the rubric of the modern. Certainly, like just the kind of time frame of when MoMA's collection begins is imagined to be post-emancipation in the United States, at least. But I think that there's a way in which the kind of modernity or modernisms of various practices made by enslaved people has a different kind of purchase or visibility in terms of telling the kind of history of creative practice and art making and material culture under the rubric of the modern, and in whatever ways we might imagine that to be happening in the end of the 19th century or across the beginning of the 20th century. So again, something that has not yet come to pass, but that feels like a precedent this work establishes for its precedents. In terms of the actual question you're asking around like, what is the precedent for other artists? I think that, I guess one is just your naming of anti-Blackness and, property acquisition as just being coterminous, if not synonymous. And in a moment where there's an attempt to align oneself with with Black culture, to understand that the terms of that alignment have to deal with other types of relationship to categories of property related to ownership and real estate. What that looks like, I think, is textured and, something I as one person inside of that place, I move with many others in that conversation. I think the reason I can say that is because I'm not the only person up in there who's asking that, and that there are many other dear colleagues together who are thinking about that. I think the other piece is just how we work with folks, right? Like this was something that, like the role of the museum, as I understand it, like you take a kind of set of assumptions or a way of working, a process, a mode of composition, and you just try to like build a structure that mimics that so that other people can come into it. And so, that logic, I think, is kind of Black, but it doesn't have to necessarily only do with Black people. I think it's Black because it understands, architecture and space as like the ways in which much of the work happens, which I think a lot of Black folks do. But it's something that, is applicable and germane to everybody.
Thank you. And that was expertly phrased, the intricacies there in the question of the museum's relationship to the politics of this sort of mode of making. A question just came in actually, which I think was in response to that and to the use of the word precedent from Emily Rails. And Emily asks, the question of precedent is interesting in the context of authorship, which was something that came up in the seminar earlier as well. Does the artist support the possibility of this model of acquisition gaining a kind of currency in the art market as a way of resistance? Can one appropriate and propagate this model? And the question, I think, is sort of initially intended for you, Cameron.
I mean, to be honest, the model of the way in which the work resides within MoMA is not unusual. It's an extended loan. There are some other extended loans from artists. There are also lots of extended loans from collectors. And so in that way, like the use of the stability of the institution, I think Thomas and I were thinking about how to use an existing framework of that the museum sort of reserves largely sort of out of respect for patrons, wherein it allows work to exist within it without owning it, and to think about how that might relate to this work. So, you know, I think that that is something that is, yes, certainly available to, and has been used by many others. I think the legal role that MoMA has agreed to take on is somewhat particular to this work, but I think that, you know, there are, of course, ways that institutions can be participant to artworks, and I think that, yeah, it would be interesting for that to, you know, be something that was more available. But I guess what I was trying to get at is that part of that availability is really only created, you know, by Thomas, or largely created by Thomas, and Thomas's willingness to pursue this, because, you know, I think maybe in trying to be as concise as possible, we sort of maybe glossed the fact that this was a over 1 year negotiation that was, you know, not exactly easy.
Yeah, and I was going to refute that singularity, because I tried to name some of the people who I work with who were, you know, very much not only kind of collaborators in the kind of mechanics of this, but in the, you know, vision of like how we might come together. So yeah, there are many other folks through the director of the museum. You know, I think, yeah, this would not have happened had, you know, a set of relationships not believed in what you were trying to make come to pass, Cameron.
I think Emily may have sort of been thinking beyond just disgorgement to the question of the rental contract and different modes of circulating artworks as something that could also itself be, to use the verb that she used, appropriated, or that could propagate more widely. And I wonder whether that aspect, which is not, you know, which is not so much in play in this work, but is in play in other works that you and Thomas presented, was something that you could also discuss, like this question of whether your commitment in your practice to circulate the products of your work in through mechanisms and in ways that undermine the paradigm of the kind of traditional capitalist paradigm of ownership, whether you think that that's also something that could and should more widely propagate. I think that's part of what Emily might have been also sort of driving at in the question.
Yeah, you know, I think that I've been asked that question before, and it's, you know, the rental project has a number of implications for, you know, the status of an artwork, right? And there are certain things that it does, like there's no secondary market for any of those works. I'm, you know, basically the sole determinant of whether, you know, how much they're transferred for. But that's not really the sort of core of the project. The core of the project is thinking about art as having this expectation of exchange and transactionality incumbent upon it, and saying that, well, this is actually a special type of commodity where within the commodity form, within that site of exchange, you know, there is the possibility for something unusual, and maybe we can use that capacity, you know, for critique. And so rather than thinking, you know, well, should we all rent artworks? I think because I'm, you know, actually less interested in saying, for a number of different reasons, that renting artworks is a solution to the problems of the art market. I think it's more interesting to say, well, what if we think about the transactional capacity or the expectation of the transactional capacity of an artwork to further a critique of property and racial capitalism?
Thank you. We have a question here from Sonia Louise Davis. Speaking of visibility, I'm so interested in the layered refusal of participation in the given terms of the art world and its consumption of Blackness, and the way in which Cameron's praxis refuses a certain kind of being seenness. And then Sonia thanks you both for the valuable conversation.
Well, I mean, I think, yeah, as we talked about a little bit earlier in the seminar, we're kind of, in a moment where the currency of that appearance has become, more pronounced. And for me, I just don't really make work about myself, so I don't really appear in it. But as Thomas and I have talked about, at length, I'm not pretending to be objective either. And so we were saying the other day, just that the idea, I guess, in the writing around the work is to allow for this, information to sit alongside whatever a viewer brings to the work, and for that not to necessarily have to do with the appearance of an individual, but maybe, the presence of this kind of collective tradition that we're talking about.
I just want to add thank you to you, Sonia, for one of these questions that has so much gift inside of it. And to say that, I think one of the ways in which I understand the body or embodiment or figuration to occur inside of your work, Cameron, something we were talking about earlier today in Tavia's class, is how the sense of the objects having been touched is made manifest in the way that you install these sculptures, so that there is a sense of, a kind of absented, but nevertheless always reappearing sense of the folks who have either used or produced or made, depending on the context, the sets of objects that one is looking at. I think that sense of the past that is animate in the work, it also has a kind of return or an inevitability to a kind of the way that haunting implicates that, imagines that there will be a moment of coming back. So I think that, as you're talking, Sonia, about how else the body or the figure appears, it is through these these non-apparent forms.
If I have a question also that I've been thinking about in relationship to two things, Thomas, to the way that you described the Just Above Midtown show, and Cameron, I mean, just in terms of the encumbrance work that's so specifically tied to the ICA in London. And it's about a word that's lurking in the background of this question will be something like decoloniality, but it's about the way that the Just Above Midtown exhibition and encumbrance are both in very specific material and historical ways tethered to the immediate geographies of the institutions in which they're active, right? And we have a ready-made, I'm using all these words now, right? We have a kind of ready-made phrase in art history that cites specificity, right? To think about that kind, but I'm thinking in response to what Thomas said earlier about how, Cameron, your work changes works already held in different art institutions. And I'm thinking about how specific to the corporate and geographic and historical specifics of the institutions that you're working in, some of the works that you produce are. And I wonder whether you could talk a little bit about how you, Cameron, think about the particular place in geography and the particular place in time in which a work of yours is located. And Thomas, if you could talk a bit in terms of your curatorial practice about how you think the various histories and communities that are constitutive of the environment in which you're practicing, because I do think it's something that seems very particular and important to both of your practices. And I think that a term like site specificity gets us nowhere really close enough to understanding how that priority is inflected in the way that you're working.
You want to go first?
I'm happy to follow you, Cam. Unless you want me to go first.
Oh, that's cool.
Please, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think we talked about it a little bit also in the seminar. But yeah, I don't really think about the work as site specific because, as Thomas was sort of indicating, it's not really about the site, as much as the site defines the location of the project, right? And so, there are, I showed, Depreciation, which uses this piece of property in South Carolina at an exhibition in Los Angeles, and some people thought that was strange, but from my perspective, the work isn't, that exhibition also talked about the legacies of displacement, on the very site that the museum was located. And those two things are not unrelated in my mind. And sort of similarly, thinking about encumbrance, encumbrance is, simultaneously thinking about that location, but also is thinking about empire, right? And where this material came from. So from my perspective, the ways in which I think about and approach context is less oriented towards, how the work might fit into it, and more sort of focused on what does the context offer that I could use. And as we were talking about, like trying to think about this sort of larger project. So there are, when I learned, for example, that this building that the ICA resides in is owned by the Crown Estate, it was like extremely useful as a material for exemplifying the legacies of coloniality, particularly in slavery, because, as I mentioned the other day, so much of the products of that economy are, consumed. And so trying to figure out on this material level, as I said, it's easier to envision that, but it's not easy, categorically. So that was one thing that I was thinking about using the institution for. And then I think the question is, how do we use it?
Thomas?
Yeah, in terms of JAM or just above Midtown, I think Linda Goodbryant, in calling that gallery just above Midtown, offers so much available material and incisive criticism of this question of location, in that it like obviates any imagination that there like could ever be like an inside and an outside, and locates itself immediately as in but not of the commercial art world by placing itself, in 1974 in the middle of kind of Gallery Row on 57th Street, but doing a kind of thing completely distinct from it. So I think that already geography in that occasion is like named as you know, all the things that geography already is, which is like status and proximity to certain forms of cultural capital. I think as we have been thinking, Linda and I have like, and the rest of the team that's working on the project, about how to render that in the present. I think the idea of decentralization or deterritorialization has been a way that we've been kind of thinking through that, so that the exhibition lives in the galleries of the Museum of Modern Art, but also lives in many other places as well. Which is to say that, you know, where there is a kind of need for the culture that was produced and continues to be produced by the kind of artists within the stream of that gallery space, can there be a mode of distribution to meet that need that the Museum of Modern Art can enable or provide, which is different from the kind of like typical outreach models that like Black shows often are expected to do, of like, oh, we now have, you know, X show on view. And this is what a great occasion to bring in school children. And I think that, you know, I think what this offers is a chance of saying, you know, how do the resources and apparatus that we have access to offer a chance to reimagine what the museum is meant to do by building a new kind of infrastructure to meet those needs. That's what I hear Linda saying in terms of how this question of location is important. I guess just to finish up, you know, it's just about this tension, I think, in like Blackness between like diaspora and movement and staying, you know, without like a fixed home, and also wanting to have a claim to a place at the same time. And the difficulty of holding those positions, but also, yeah, I think the necessity in the same breath.
Thank you so much. We're just now reaching the end of the event, and so I'm going to try and bundle two questions into one. Apologies to the individual question asking folks, Emmanuel Admasu and Jalil Porcher, if I sort of butcher a little bit what it was that you're asking and trying to do so, but we have to wrap in just a few minutes. So let's see how I'll do this. So Jalil's asking if you could speak about, and this I think is specifically for Cameron, your method, the method in your practice of acquiring objects that were produced by convicted people, and deploying them in a practice that's also simultaneously arrayed in support of reparation. And Emmanuel's asking whether you could talk about how, if we think that particular activity within the context of a moment that we're living in, which Saidiya Hartman is so perfectly described as the afterlife of slavery, and I think Saidiya is with us. If we think about that condition as one where racial capitalism continuously absorbs everything that was seemingly opposed to it, then how might we consider the risk or the possibility that your artistic strategies might themselves also be susceptible to reabsorption? So I don't know if that's a good enough bridge between those two questions, but yeah, but the method of appropriating objects that themselves are the issue of, or the product of incarceration, and then this question of co-optation by racial capital of the methodologies that you yourself are developing.
Mm-hmm.
And thank you everybody whose questions we weren't able to get to. I'm very grateful for all of those.
There are wonderful questions in here.
Hmm. Maybe should I start and then we can finish together too? I mean, you know, this was something that, you know, I was obviously thinking about for a long time. I was working on this project over 2 years, and it came about, you know, through trying to better understand the scale of the correctional industries programs in New York State particularly, but also in general. And also trying to understand what they are for. So realizing that the primary role is not to simply maintain the carceral institution, but that it is a through line across institutions of carcerality and other forms of judicial violence into the what many call the carceral state, was really important for me, and in a certain way it's like best exemplified by the leveler rings, right? And that's the reason that they are one of the works that kind of put together, or one of the materials that I chose, because those leveler rings are basically used anytime any road is repaved in New York State, and so every time you walk out, you're walking on that labor. And so similarly, public school, public university furniture in New York State is all made by Corecraft. Bus wash is all made by Corecraft. The purpose is, again, not to just generate profits for the carceral institution, but to offer a cut rate price on these commodities to governmental and nonprofit organizations. And so part of what I'm trying to articulate are these numerous benefits that nonprofit organizations receive, and that goes from the private university, the private hospital, to the private art institution, all of which are private nonprofit organizations. So from my perspective, the materials themselves are actually omnipresent, and so constituting them as these works and arranging this registration of artist space with Corecraft to do so was a way of intentionally outlining our dependencies, as opposed to trying to continue ignoring them. I think with regard to the second question about the, what I think of, and we talked about this a little bit earlier too, it's funny, there's so many things, what I think of as the capacity, the sort of capacity of or for recuperation is a really complicated question. And I think all of us doing critical work are trying to think about the ways that that work might exist in the world enough to be impactful, or have some relationship to these processes that are, the focus of the critique, without then, providing value to the vehicles that make such critique accessible. And I think it's an extremely complex and nuanced conversation that's occurred throughout art history, and has also, occurred in so many different ways throughout the academy. And I think that part of what maybe we're thinking about together is the ways in which that recuperative value is achieved is through the sort of rubric of individual achievement. And, you know, if we sort of don't focus on propriety, when we think about, you know, these ways that we're learning from and teaching each other and are actually sort of in this together, then, you know, we already have the thing that we're talking about. And so I think that there are ways of being together in that critique that aren't about, you know, an institution validating it, creating value and property out of it as the means for its dissemination.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Cameron. And maybe just as like a, you know, small citation. Well, yeah, I think that, you know, the risk of co-optation and absorption are real and deep, and I think one thinks about every day. And also, one has to not think about too much because one has one's work to do too, and kind of faith in the kind of ongoing uncapturability that exists alongside of predation. And yeah, I guess in some ways, you know, something that's perhaps more vibrant for me is less in what ways might this be, you know, these practices or strategies be absorbed, but in what ways we also can take on as our own a set of practices never imagined to be ours, but to name them as such. And yeah, I'm thinking of a poet that Cameron sent me a book of her work, Lorna Goodison, who was like recently being asked about her own relationship to writing, you know, within a kind of British tradition, and how she, you know, her kind of revolution and refusal was kind of like being co-opted in that tradition. Told the story of an enslaved woman who went before the court for stealing sugar on a plantation in Jamaica, and whose defense was, me no thief from master, me take. So that direction of taking is, I think, in this moment, more of my concern than the ways in which what we're up to, for the reasons you named, Cameron, might be stolen by others.
Thank you both so much. Yeah, a last thought occurred to me in relation to what you're saying, and I need to turn over to Tina as we wrap up, but there's also perhaps, as we think in sort of art, historical and art institutional ways, a risk of placing too much emphasis on specific temporal, specific strategies that emerge at particular moments in relationship to particular problems. And extrapolating them forward through time as if they need to remain fixed and constant, as though that is the innovation that needs to be owned by the person who's produced it. And that, I think, might de-emphasize the ways in which the actions and decisions are always contingent, always contextual, and therefore will invariably sort of shift and change over time. But thank you both for such an incredibly generous discussion and presentation. And thanks to everybody for the questions. Again, our apologies, we weren't able to accommodate everybody, but I've copied and pasted those questions into a document, and I'll share them with Cameron and Thomas, and hopefully we'll have occasion at some point in the future to do a part 2 of this somewhere else under some other configuration, and maybe we can circle back to some of those ideas. But Tina, over to you.
Yeah, I want to echo your thanks to everyone, and just say, yes, I do hope that we can actually continue this conversation in situ when we are finally able to inhabit a shared space. And I want to thank Cameron and Thomas just for embodying the kind of collaboration that we really aspire to do, both in our teaching and our thinking, but also in creative practice. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you everyone for amazing questions and a wonderful hour and a half spent together. So for now, I'll say bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tina. Thank you, Stanley.
You're welcome. Bye.